History is written by the victors, but sometimes victory happens in spite of the people in charge. World War II was a conflict defined by brilliant strategy and unbelievable heroism, but it was also plagued by some of the most staggering incompetence you can possibly imagine. We're talking about generals who ordered cavalry charges against panzer tanks, commanders who surrendered to armies half their size, and one guy who was so obsessed with his personal bunker that he built it 100 miles away from the actual battle. And that's barely scratching the surface. Today we are counting down the 10 absolute worst generals of the Second World War. These are the men whose blunders, ego, and sheer absurdity cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and in some cases nearly lost the entire war. So let's kick things off with a story of American ineptitude so bizarre it's almost funny. Almost. Our number 10 spot goes to a man who proves that even the so-called greatest generation had its fair share of duds. U.S. General Lloyd Fredendall. Guys, this man was less of a military commander and more of a paranoid interior decorator. With an unlimited budget. Deployed to North Africa for Operation Torch, Fredendall was tasked with leading American forces against Rommel's hardened Afrika Corps. This was America's big debut in the European African theater. The world was watching. And what did Fredendall do? He immediately focused on what was truly important. Building himself a ridiculously elaborate bomb-proof bunker. I'm not exaggerating. He tasked an entire engineering battalion, the same number of men who built the Pentagon, with blasting a massive command complex out of a mountainside. This bunker was a full 100 miles away from the front lines he was supposed to be commanding. You can't make this stuff up. He was so detached from the action, he could have been ordering a pizza in another country. He insisted on speaking in a bizarre self-made code, referring to infantry as walking boys and artillery as plowing boys. His subordinates had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. It was chaos. So when the Germans finally attacked at Kasserine Pass, was anyone surprised that Fredendall's leadership completely disintegrated? He had no idea where his units were, he issued contradictory orders, and his troops, poorly led and confused, were utterly routed in one of the most humiliating American defeats of the war. Eisenhower was so furious he sacked him almost immediately. Fredendall is the perfect opener for this list. A story of incompetence so pure, it's a miracle his men accomplished anything at all. But if you think getting routed because your boss is a bunker-obsessed weirdo is bad, that's nothing compared to our next general, who managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. At number 9 is British Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the man who orchestrated the single most humiliating surrender in British military history: the fall of Singapore. On paper, Percival should have been untouchable. He had over 85,000 Commonwealth troops under his command. The attacking Japanese force? They had just over 30,000. That's nearly a 3-to-1 advantage. Yet Percival was utterly convinced the Japanese would attack from the sea, so all of Singapore's famous, massive coastal guns were pointed in the wrong direction when Japanese forces came through the jungle from the north. When the Japanese commander Tomoyuki Yamashita demanded his surrender, Percival, despite his overwhelming numbers, just caved. He was bluffed into believing the Japanese force was much larger than it was. He surrendered the Gibraltar of the East in a move that Churchill called the worst disaster in British history. Next up, we're dialing up the villainy. At number 8, we have Italian Marshal Rodolfo Graziani. This guy wasn't just incompetent, he was monstrous. Known as the Butcher of Ethiopia for his brutal war crimes there before World War II even started, Graziani was put in command of the Italian 10th Army in North Africa. He had a massive numerical advantage over the British forces opposing him. We're talking about a 5-to-1 superiority in troops. His orders from Mussolini were simple: invade Egypt. And he did, sort of. He advanced a whole 60 miles into Egypt, and then, completely paralyzed by fear and indecision, he just stopped. For 3 months, he did absolutely nothing, allowing the vastly outnumbered British to build up their forces and plan a counterattack. He was so terrified of the British that he famously told his own staff, "When you have a superiority of tanks, you have this feeling of being safe." It's like, dude, you're the one with the superiority! When the British finally launched their counteroffensive, Operation Compass, they didn't just stop Graziani, they annihilated him. A tiny British force of 30,000 men completely destroyed his army of 150,000, taking over 130,000 prisoners. Graziani abandoned his men and fled. It was one of the most lopsided defeats of the entire war, engineered by a man whose cruelty was matched only by his cowardice. But as bad as losing with a 5-1 advantage is, our next general managed to get hundreds of thousands of his own men killed by literally bringing horses to a tank fight. At number 7, say hello to Soviet Marshal Semyon Budyonny. Budyonny was a classic case of a guy who was great in the last war and absolutely useless in the current one. He was an old Bolshevik crony of Stalin's, a legendary cavalry commander from the Russian Civil War. The problem, by 1941, cavalry wasn't exactly cutting-edge military technology. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, Budyonny was placed in command of the Southwestern Front, tasked with defending Ukraine. He was facing the likes of Gerd von Rundstedt and Heinz Guderian, the architects of Blitzkrieg. And what was Budyonny's brilliant strategy? Cavalry charges. He literally ordered his men on horseback to charge German machine gun nests and panzer divisions. The result was exactly what you'd expect, a complete and utter massacre. His refusal to adapt, his insistence on outdated tactics, and his mindless belief in the offensive charge created the perfect trap. The Germans encircled his forces near Kiev in what became the largest single encirclement in military history. The Soviets lost 500,000 men, killed or captured, because one of Stalin's buddies thought dashing horses were a match for modern armor. Stalin eventually had to pull him out, but the damage was done. Budyonny single-handedly caused one of the biggest Soviet disasters of the war. From a general who was too aggressive, we now pivot to one who wasn't aggressive enough. At number 6 is U.S. General John Lucas, the man who turned a brilliant amphibious landing into a sitting duck disaster. In January 1944, the Allies launched Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing at Anzio, Italy. The goal was to bypass Germany's heavily fortified Gustav Line and open a path to Rome. The landing itself was a spectacular success. The Germans were caught completely by surprise. The beaches were empty. The road to Rome was wide open. And what did General Lucas do with this golden opportunity? Absolutely nothing. He was, in his own words, prodded into a mission he didn't believe in. Instead of racing inland and seizing the Alban Hills, which would have shattered the German position, Lucas chose to dig in and fortify his beachhead. He was terrified of a German counterattack. Churchill famously fumed, "I had hoped we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore, but all we got was a stranded whale." His caution gave the Germans all the time they needed to rush reinforcements to the area, surround the beachhead, and turn Anzio into a bloody 4-month-long battle of attrition. What should have been a lightning strike became a meat grinder, all because the man in charge was too scared to take the win that was handed to him on a silver platter. But if you think one man's indecision is bad, our next general's total lack of action led to the fall of an entire nation. At number 5, we have the architect of France's humiliating 1940 defeat, General Maurice Gamelin. Gamelin was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in France, and he was a man utterly trapped in the past. He was still fighting World War I. He was completely convinced that any German attack would be a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan from 1914, coming through central Belgium. He staked everything on this assumption. All of France's best mobile units, its best tanks and troops, were sent north to meet this phantom attack. Meanwhile, he left the Ardennes forest, a hilly and wooded region, defended by only a handful of second-rate reserve divisions. Why? Because he, along with the entire French High Command, believed the forest was impenetrable to tanks. Guys, can we just pause for a second and appreciate the absurdity? They just decided an entire section of the border was magically tank-proof. Of course, the Germans' main panzer thrust came directly through the impenetrable Ardennes. When the news came in, Gamlen's response was catastrophically slow. His command center was a joke, with no radios and reliant on motorcycle couriers for information. For hours on the most critical day of the invasion, he was completely unreachable. He had essentially set up a system where he couldn't command even if he wanted to. By the time he realized what was happening, German tanks were already pouring across France, his best armies were trapped in Belgium, and the battle for France was effectively lost. In 6 weeks. Gamlen didn't just lose a battle. His spectacular miscalculation lost the entire country. Next on our list is an American general so obsessed with his own fame that he repeatedly put his soldiers' lives at risk for a good newspaper headline. At number 4 is General Mark W. Clark. Clark was the commander of the U.S. Fifth Army in the Italian campaign, and his defining characteristic was a bottomless hunger for personal glory. His entire strategy seemed to be based on what would make him look best in the papers back home. The most infamous example came in May 1944. The brutal battle for Monte Cassino had finally been won, and the German Gustav Line was broken. The plan was for Clark's Fifth Army to trap the retreating German 10th Army, which would have destroyed it and potentially ended the Italian campaign right then and there. But Clark had other ideas. He saw a chance for a much bigger prize, at least in his mind, being the man who personally liberated Rome. So, against direct orders and all military logic, he ignored the retreating German army. He reoriented his entire force and made a mad dash for the city. He got his headlines, he rode triumphantly into Rome, and the press hailed him as a hero. But while he was posing for cameras, the entire German 10th Army slipped away, escaping the trap to fight another day. They established a new defensive line in northern Italy, and the result was another year of bloody, brutal fighting that cost tens of thousands of Allied lives. Lives that were traded for one man's scrapbook. But as bad as a Glory Hound is, he's got nothing on our next general, a man whose position was owed entirely to political connections and whose incompetence led to one of the most horrific sieges in human history. Coming in at number 3 is Clement Voroshilov, another one of Stalin's old, unqualified cronies. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin, in his infinite wisdom, put Voroshilov in charge of defending Leningrad, the second most important city in the country. To say Voroshilov was out of his depth is a grotesque understatement. The man was a military fossil. His idea of defense was, like Budyani, completely archaic. He had no grasp of modern combined arms warfare. Instead of preparing layered defenses or using his armor effectively, he ordered suicidal counterattacks that bled the Red Army dry. He personally led one charge from the front armed with only a pistol, which sounds heroic until you realize the job of a commanding general isn't to play soldier, it's to command the army, and he was terrible at it. His ineptitude made it incredibly easy for the Germans to encircle Leningrad, beginning the infamous 872-day siege. Millions of civilians were trapped. Under Voroshilov's command, no adequate preparations had been made for a long siege. Food and fuel supplies were disastrously low. His failure to establish a strong defensive perimeter before the trap closed resulted in a level of human suffering that is almost impossible to comprehend. People starved to death in the streets. Stalin eventually replaced him with Georgy Zhukov, who managed to stabilize the front, but the damage was done. Voroshilov's appointment wasn't just a mistake, it was a crime. But for all the blunders of cronies, glory hounds, and cowards, there is one man whose direct military decisions were more catastrophic, more delusional, and more costly than any other. He wasn't just a political leader, he was the worst general of them all. The runner-up for the worst general of World War II, our number 2 spot goes to the Führer himself, Adolf Hitler. Now, you might say it's cheating to put a political leader on this list, but by 1942, Hitler wasn't just the leader of Germany, he was the de facto supreme commander of its armed forces, meddling in every single aspect of military operations. And his instincts were almost always wrong. Hitler's greatest flaw as a general was his victory disease, combined with a complete refusal to ever countenance a retreat. To him, giving up ground for any reason was a sign of moral weakness. This single insane belief was directly responsible for Germany's most devastating defeat, Stalingrad. As the German 6th Army pushed into the city, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, encircling the entire army. His generals, men like Paulus and Manstein, begged him to allow the 6th Army to break out. A breakout was possible, they could have saved the army, but Hitler refused. He pounded his fists on the table and screamed that the Volga would be held. He promised the army they would be supplied by the Air Force, a promise the Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring knew was impossible to keep. So the 6th Army sat there, freezing, starving, dying. All because of one man's delusional obsession with holding a city that no longer had any strategic value. He turned a veteran, victorious army of 300,000 men into a frozen graveyard. And this was just one example. His no-retreat orders repeatedly led to German armies being needlessly encircled and annihilated across the Eastern Front. He was the ultimate micromanager of defeat. And now for our final spot. After the epic disaster of Hitler's command, we end with a story that's less about pure incompetence and more about being handed an impossible situation. At number 1, we have British General Lord Gort. Gort was the commander-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, sent to France in 1939, and when the German Blitzkrieg shattered the French lines in 1940, Gort and his entire army found themselves in an absolutely hopeless position. The French armies to their south had collapsed, the Belgian army to their north was about to surrender, the German panzer divisions were closing in from all sides, threatening to annihilate the entire British force. Gort was receiving contradictory and nonsensical orders from both London and the collapsing French command. He was being told to launch a major counterattack south to link up with the French, a move he knew was impossible and suicidal with the forces he had. So Gort made a choice. It was a choice that would be debated for years, but it arguably saved the war for Britain. He ignored his orders. Instead of trying to launch a futile attack, he made the unilateral decision to save his army. He ordered his forces to pull back to the coast to a small port town called Dunkirk. This decision was technically an act of defiance. He was abandoning the fight in France, but it was also the only sane move to make. This decision led directly to the miracle of Dunkirk, where over 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated to fight another day. Gort lost the battle for France, but by making that tough call, he saved the British Army, which lived on to be the core of the force that would eventually liberate Europe. It's a different kind of failure, the failure to win an unwinnable fight, but the wisdom to save what you can from the wreckage. So there you have it, 10 men whose decisions, for reasons of ego, incompetence, or impossible circumstances, led to some of the greatest disasters of World War II. But if you think these military blunders are unbelievable, they are nothing compared to the conspiracies and secret operations from the war that sound like fiction, but were actually 100% true. So click this video right here because you will not believe the insane plots from bat bombs to ghost armies that were actually real. You have to see it to believe it.